What would you do if someone asked you to risk everything you've worked for to help them? Today's story is about a federal judge from Colorado whose entire world changed when she received an impossible request during a routine sentencing hearing. This isn't just another story about breaking rules or crossing lines. This is about a choice that would test everything she believed in and transform two lives in ways neither could have imagined. Before we dive deep into this incredible journey, I want you to know that what you're about to hear will challenge how you think about justice, truth, and the power of one person's determination to do what's right. If stories like this move you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Trust me, you'll want to stay until the very end, because this story has twists you won't see coming. Let's begin with Judge Elizabeth Morrison, a 38-year-old federal judge who had spent her entire career upholding the law with unwavering dedication. She wasn't one of those judges who brought personal feelings into the courtroom or allowed emotions to cloud their judgment. Elizabeth was different. Her colleagues respected her because she treated everyone who appeared before her with dignity, whether they were prosecutors, defense attorneys, victims, or defendants. She had this quiet authority about her that commanded respect without demanding it. People paid attention when Judge Morrison spoke from the bench. Elizabeth had always dreamed of working in the legal system. Growing up in Boulder, Colorado, she watched her mother work as a public defender for over 25 years. Her mother taught her that serving justice meant more than just applying the law. It meant understanding that behind every case was a human story, that the scales of justice had to be balanced with both firmness and compassion. Most importantly, it meant never compromising your integrity, no matter what pressures you faced. Her mother had shown her that real justice required both a sharp mind and an open heart. After graduating from Yale Law School near the top of her class, Elizabeth started her career as a federal prosecutor in Denver. She handled white-collar crimes, organized crime cases, and complex fraud investigations. Her supervisors noticed her immediately. She was brilliant, thorough, and had this natural ability to see patterns in evidence that others missed. Other prosecutors started seeking her advice on their cases because they knew she had an almost intuitive understanding of how criminal enterprises operated. But Elizabeth's dedication to fairness sometimes put her at odds with others who prioritized conviction rates over truth. When she witnessed prosecutors withholding exculpatory evidence or pressuring witnesses to change their statements, she reported it. When she saw corners being cut to secure convictions, she spoke up. When supervisors tried to pressure her into pursuing charges she didn't believe were supported by the evidence, she stood firm. This earned her respect from many, but it also made her enemies within the U.S. Attorney's Office. Some of her colleagues viewed her as self-righteous, as someone who cared more about theoretical notions of justice than about winning cases and building careers. The breaking point came when she discovered that the lead prosecutor on one of the office's biggest cases had suppressed evidence that could have exonerated the defendant. The case involved a pharmaceutical executive accused of insider trading and securities fraud. The evidence suggested guilt, but Elizabeth had found documents during discovery that raised serious questions about the timeline of events. When she brought these concerns to her supervisor, she was told to stop second-guessing the investigation and focus on her own cases. When she persisted, making it clear that she believed they had an ethical obligation to turn over the materials to the defense, the atmosphere in the office became toxic. 3 months later, Elizabeth made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She resigned from the prosecutor's office and joined a small, non-profit legal organization that represented indigent defendants in federal court. Her former colleagues were stunned. She had been on track to become a supervisory prosecutor within a few years, potentially even the U.S. attorney someday, But Elizabeth had realized that she cared more about ensuring justice was actually served than about advancing her career within a system that sometimes prioritized winning over truth. For 5 years, Elizabeth worked defending people who couldn't afford private attorneys. She took on cases that other lawyers avoided, representing defendants in complex, white-collar cases, immigration matters, and appeals of wrongful convictions. She won more than she lost, not because she was a better lawyer than the prosecutors she faced, but because she was willing to dig deeper, to spend countless hours reviewing evidence, to interview every possible witness. She developed a reputation as someone who never gave up on a client, who believed that everyone deserved a vigorous defense, regardless of what they were accused of. Her work caught the attention of several federal judges who admired her dedication and legal acumen. When a vacancy opened on the federal bench for the District of Colorado, 3 different judges encouraged her to apply. Elizabeth initially resisted. She was only 35 years old, younger than most federal judicial appointees. She worried that leaving direct client representation would mean abandoning the people who needed her most. But her mentors convinced her that she could do more good as a judge, that she could ensure fairness for thousands of defendants rather than dozens. The nomination process was grueling. Elizabeth faced intense scrutiny from senators on both sides of the aisle. Conservative senators questioned whether her background as a defense attorney would make her too lenient on criminals. Progressive senators wanted assurances that her time as a prosecutor hadn't hardened her against defendants' rights. Elizabeth navigated these confirmation hearings with the same principled approach she brought to everything else. She explained that she believed in the rule of law, in the Constitution, and in the fundamental principle that justice required both holding wrongdoers accountable and protecting the innocent from government overreach. She was confirmed on a bipartisan vote and took her place on the federal bench at age 36, one of the youngest federal judges in the country. Judge Morrison quickly established herself as thoughtful, prepared, and scrupulously fair. She ran her courtroom with efficiency, but never rushed proceedings. She asked probing questions of witnesses, but never badgered them. She gave lawyers leeway to make their arguments, but didn't tolerate grandstanding or gamesmanship. Defense attorneys and prosecutors alike learned that Judge Morrison had done her homework before every hearing, that she had read every brief thoroughly, and that she expected the same level of preparation from them. But after 2 years on the bench, one case would challenge everything Elizabeth believed about the legal system and her role within it. It started on an ordinary Tuesday morning in late September. Judge Morrison's docket that day included several routine matters: a sentencing hearing for a tax fraud conviction, motions in a drug conspiracy case, and a status conference on a complex securities fraud prosecution. Nothing about the schedule suggested that her life was about to change forever. The sentencing hearing was for a man named Marcus Williams, a 34-year-old former quality assurance director at a large food manufacturing company. Williams had been convicted 8 months earlier of embezzlement, wire fraud, and falsifying corporate records. The prosecution had presented evidence that Williams had systematically stolen money from the company over a 3-year period, using his position to create fake vendors and route payments to accounts he controlled. The jury had deliberated for less than a day before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Elizabeth had not presided over the trial itself. Another judge had handled it before retiring. When that judge left the bench, his pending sentencing matters had been reassigned to her. She had reviewed the trial transcripts, the pre-sentence investigation report, and the sentencing memoranda submitted by both the prosecution and defense. Everything pointed to a straightforward white-collar crime case. The evidence had been overwhelming, the verdict had been unanimous, and the guidelines called for a sentence in the range of 12 to 15 years. But when Marcus Williams was brought into the courtroom that morning, something struck Elizabeth as odd. She had sentenced dozens of white-collar criminals during her time on the bench. Most fell into predictable categories: the defiant ones who maintained their innocence and blamed others, the remorseful ones who wept and apologized, the calculated ones who said whatever they thought might reduce their sentence. Williams was different. He stood before her bench with quiet dignity, his eyes meeting hers directly without hostility or pleading. There was something in his demeanor that didn't match the profile of someone who had spent 3 years systematically stealing from his employer. The prosecutor, an assistant U.S. attorney named Jennifer Peterson, whom Elizabeth knew to be competent and ethical, argued for a sentence at the high end of the guidelines. Peterson emphasized the sophisticated nature of the fraud scheme, the amount of money involved, over $200,000, and the need for deterrence. She painted a picture of Williams as a calculated criminal who had abused his position of trust and shown no remorse for his actions. Williams's defense attorney, an overworked public defender named Thomas Chen, made a perfunctory argument for a sentence at the low end of the guidelines. He mentioned Williams's lack of prior criminal history, his cooperation with probation officials during the pre-sentence investigation, and his family circumstances. But even Chen seemed to be going through the motions. There was no passion in his voice, no sense that he truly believed his client deserved leniency. Elizabeth had seen this before: public defenders who had so many cases that they couldn't give any single client the attention they deserved. Then it was Williams's turn to speak. Federal rules gave every defendant the right to address the court before sentencing. Most defendants either said nothing or delivered prepared statements written by their attorneys. Williams did neither. He stood, looked directly at Elizabeth, and began speaking in a calm, measured voice that commanded attention. He told her that he understood she had a job to do, that she needed to impose a sentence that reflected the seriousness of the crimes he had been convicted of. He said he wasn't asking for mercy or special treatment. But then he said something that made Elizabeth lean forward slightly in her chair. He said that he hoped someday the truth would come out, that he prayed his daughter would know he had not been the man the jury believed him to be. His voice caught slightly when he mentioned his daughter, but he maintained his composure. Williams explained that his daughter Lily had been fighting leukemia since she was 7 years old. She was now 10, and her condition had worsened during his trial. He had been allowed to visit her in the hospital twice during his incarceration, while awaiting sentencing, both times shackled and under guard. He had made her a promise during those visits that he would prove his innocence and be there for her treatments and recovery. Now, he was about to be sentenced to more than a decade in federal prison, and that promise seemed impossible to keep. But he told Elizabeth that he would never stop fighting to clear his name, not for himself, but so that Lily would know her father had been an honest man. There was something about the way Williams spoke that troubled Elizabeth. She had developed good instincts over years of evaluating witness credibility and defendant statements. Most guilty defendants who claimed innocence had tells. They became defensive when questioned. Their stories shifted slightly under scrutiny. They focused on technicalities rather than fundamental truth. Williams displayed none of these patterns. His statement wasn't argumentative or self-serving. He didn't attack the prosecution or claim the system was rigged. He simply maintained his innocence with a quiet conviction that was either completely genuine or the performance of a master manipulator. Elizabeth imposed a sentence of 13 years in the middle of the guidelines range. She explained her reasoning from the bench, noting the seriousness of the offenses and the need for deterrence, while acknowledging Williams's lack of criminal history and family circumstances. Williams accepted the sentence without visible emotion, thanked her for her consideration, and was led out of the courtroom by U.S. Marshals. The hearing lasted less than 45 minutes. Elizabeth moved on to her next matter, expecting never to think about Marcus Williams again. But she couldn't stop thinking about his statement. That evening, sitting in her chambers after the courthouse had emptied, Elizabeth found herself pulling up the trial transcripts on her computer. She told herself she was just curious, that there was no reason to second-guess another judge's trial management or the jury's verdict. But something about Williams's demeanor and his words about his daughter had lodged in her mind like a splinter. She started reading through the transcripts, beginning with opening statements. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. Williams had used his position as quality assurance director to create fictitious vendor accounts, approve fraudulent invoices, and route payments to bank accounts he controlled. They had presented bank records showing payments to accounts linked to Williams, email evidence of him approving invoices for the fake vendors, and testimony from company accountants about irregularities they had discovered. The defense theory, such as it was, seemed weak. Chen had argued that Williams had been framed by other executives at the company who were actually responsible for the fraud. But he had presented little evidence to support this theory. No other suspects were named. No alternative explanation for how Williams's information ended up associated with the fraudulent accounts was offered. The defense case had consisted mainly of character witnesses who testified that Williams was honest and hard-working, and Williams's own testimony denying any involvement in the fraud. Elizabeth continued reading through several days of trial testimony. The prosecution's case seemed solid. Multiple witnesses had identified irregularities in the company's accounts. Forensic accountants had traced the flow of money from the company to accounts that appeared to be connected to Williams. The evidence seemed overwhelming, and yet something nagged at Elizabeth as she read. The defense had barely cross-examined the government's forensic accountant. They had not called their own financial expert. They had not meaningfully challenged the chain of custody for the banking records, or questioned how Williams's information had been associated with the fraudulent accounts. It was past midnight when Elizabeth finally closed her computer and went home. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that she was letting one defendant's emotional statement cloud her professional judgment. The jury had heard all the evidence and reached a verdict. An experienced trial judge had presided over the proceedings and found no legal errors significant enough to warrant a mistrial or new trial. Her job had been to impose an appropriate sentence, which she had done. There was no reason for her to be obsessing over this case. But over the following weeks, Elizabeth found her thoughts returning to Marcus Williams at odd moments. When she sentenced other defendants, she thought about his quiet dignity. When she reviewed pre-sentence reports mentioning defendants' children, she thought about Lily fighting leukemia while her father sat in federal prison. Elizabeth had never been one to let emotions interfere with her judicial duties, but she also believed that judges were human beings who shouldn't completely wall off their capacity for empathy and doubt. 2 months after the sentencing, Elizabeth received a motion that brought the Williams case back into her courtroom. It was a motion for a new trial based on newly discovered evidence, filed by a different attorney who had taken over Williams's case. The new lawyer, a young woman named Sarah Delgado, who worked for an innocence project, had uncovered evidence that had not been presented at trial. Elizabeth read through the motion with growing interest. Delgado had tracked down a former executive at Williams's company who had been fired shortly before Williams was arrested. This executive, a man named Robert Henshaw, had reached out to Delgado after reading about Williams's conviction in the newspaper. Henshaw had his own grievances with the company and had kept copies of emails and documents he thought might be relevant. According to Delgado's motion, these documents showed that senior executives at the company had been aware of financial irregularities long before Williams was accused, that there had been an internal investigation that pointed toward different suspects, and that Williams's name had not come up in that investigation. More significantly, Delgado had found evidence suggesting that the bank accounts supposedly controlled by Williams had actually been opened using stolen identity information. Someone had used Williams's social security number and personal information to create the accounts, but Williams himself had never had access to them. This evidence had apparently existed before trial, but had not been turned over to the defense during discovery. Elizabeth scheduled a hearing on the motion. She knew that motions for new trials based on newly discovered evidence faced a high legal bar. The evidence had to be truly new, meaning it could not have been discovered with reasonable diligence before or during trial. It had to be material, meaning it could have changed the outcome. And it had to be credible and not merely cumulative or impeaching. Many such motions failed to meet these standards. The hearing took place on a cold February morning, 4 months after Williams' sentencing. The courtroom was packed with more people than typically attended routine post-trial motions. Several reporters had gotten wind that there might be significant developments in a case involving corporate fraud. Williams was brought in wearing prison clothes, his hair slightly longer than it had been at sentencing, his face thinner. Elizabeth saw him glance toward the gallery, where a woman who must have been his ex-wife sat with a young girl wearing a colorful scarf wrapped around her head. Lily, the daughter, with leukemia. Elizabeth forced herself to focus on the legal arguments rather than the emotional weight of that scene. Sarah Delgado presented her case with impressive thoroughness. She had clearly done extensive investigation since taking on Williams's case. She called Robert Henshaw as a witness. Henshaw testified that he had been the company's chief financial officer until he was terminated under questionable circumstances. He described an internal investigation into financial irregularities that had identified several senior executives as persons of interest. According to Henshaw, Williams's name had not been mentioned in that investigation. Shortly after Henshaw had reported his findings to the board of directors, he had been fired for unrelated performance issues. Henshaw also testified that shortly before his termination, he had been approached by 2 of the executives named in his investigation. They had suggested that if certain evidence could point towards someone in a lower-level position, someone without powerful connections, the company could resolve its problems without damaging its reputation or exposing senior leadership to criminal liability. Henshaw had refused to participate in what he understood to be a plan to frame someone. 2 weeks later, he was terminated. Delgado then presented evidence about the bank accounts. She had retained a forensic computer expert who had examined the digital trail of when and how the accounts were opened. The expert testified that the accounts had been created using an IP address associated with the company's corporate network, but at times when Williams had been verifiably in different locations. Security badge records showed Williams entering and leaving the building at times that did not match when someone had logged into the banking system to set up the fraudulent accounts. The prosecution fought back vigorously. Jennifer Peterson argued that Henshaw was a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind, that his testimony was not credible, and that the defense was asking the court to overturn a jury verdict based on speculation and conspiracy theories. She pointed out that the jury had heard Williams testify in his own defense and had clearly not believed him. She argued that the new evidence was not material because it did not directly prove Williams's innocence, only raised questions about whether others might also have been involved. Elizabeth listened carefully to both sides. She pressed Delgado on why this evidence had not been discovered before trial. Delgado explained that Williams's original attorney had been overwhelmed with cases and had not conducted a thorough investigation. The attorney had accepted the prosecution's theory of the case and had assumed that mounting a defense would require proving someone else committed the crimes, rather than focusing on whether the evidence actually proved Williams's guilt. Delgado admitted this was not ideal, but argued that ineffective assistance of counsel should not mean an innocent man remained in prison. Elizabeth took the matter under advisement. She spent the next 3 weeks doing something federal judges rarely did, conducting her own investigation into the evidence. She reviewed every document Delgado had submitted. She compared the trial testimony with the new evidence. She researched the legal standards for granting new trials and studied similar cases from other circuits. She found herself working late into the night, driven by a growing conviction that something had gone terribly wrong in the Williams prosecution. The more Elizabeth dug into the case, the more troubling it became. She discovered that the company Williams had worked for, Nutritional Systems Incorporated, had been the subject of multiple federal investigations over the years for safety violations and financial irregularities. Those investigations had repeatedly been closed without charges being filed. She found news articles about other whistleblowers at the company who had faced retaliation. She discovered that the company's general counsel had previously worked in the U.S. Attorney's Office and maintained close relationships with federal prosecutors. Elizabeth knew she had to be careful. Judges were supposed to be neutral arbiters, not investigators or advocates. Her role was to evaluate the legal arguments presented by the parties, not to conduct independent fact-finding. But she also knew that judges had an obligation to ensure that justice was actually served, that the legal system produced fair outcomes, not just procedurally correct ones. If an innocent man was sitting in federal prison because of prosecutorial misconduct or a woefully inadequate defense, didn't she have some responsibility to address that? 3 weeks after the hearing, Elizabeth issued a 30-page order granting Williams' motion for a new trial. She found that the newly discovered evidence was material and could have affected the jury's verdict. She noted that the prosecution had apparently failed to turn over evidence of the internal investigation that pointed to other suspects, a potential violation of the government's obligations under Brady versus Maryland. She wrote that while the original trial judge had not committed any obvious legal errors, the totality of circumstances suggested that Williams had not received the effective assistance of counsel guaranteed by the Sixth Amendment. Elizabeth's order sent shockwaves through the legal community. Federal judges rarely granted new trials in criminal cases, especially in cases where the evidence of guilt had seemed strong. The U.S. Attorney's Office immediately filed a notice of appeal, arguing that Judge Morrison had overstepped her bounds and usurped the jury's role as finder of fact. Several prominent legal commentators criticized the decision as judicial activism. But Elizabeth also received support from defense attorneys and wrongful conviction advocates who praised her willingness to look beyond procedure to ensure a fair outcome. The government's appeal would take months to work its way through the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. In the meantime, Marcus Williams remained in federal prison, now serving the sentence Elizabeth had imposed. She followed the case through the legal publications and news reports, wondering if she had made the right decision. Judges were not supposed to second-guess themselves after ruling, but Elizabeth couldn't help questioning whether she had let her emotional response to Williams' statement about his daughter cloud her legal judgment. Then, 5 months after her order granting a new trial, something happened that changed everything. A mid-level executive at Nutritional Systems Incorporated named Patricia Valdez came forward with stunning evidence. Valdez had been diagnosed with terminal cancer and wanted to clear her conscience before she died. She provided federal investigators with documents, emails, and recorded conversations that proved senior executives at the company had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to frame Williams for embezzlement they had committed. According to Valdez's evidence, the executives had stolen millions of dollars from the company over several years through the fake vendor scheme. When internal auditors began asking questions, the executives needed a scapegoat. They had chosen Williams because he was in a position that made him plausible suspect. He lacked the political connections to fight back effectively, and he had recently raised safety concerns about some of the company's products. making him a troublesome employee they wanted to eliminate anyway. The executives had used their access to company systems to create the fraudulent bank accounts using Williams's personal information. They had generated fake emails that appeared to show Williams approving the fraudulent invoices. They had planted evidence that would point to him. And when their scheme worked and Williams was arrested, they had used their connections in the U.S. Attorney's Office to ensure the prosecution moved forward quickly before anyone could look too carefully at alternative theories. Valdez's revelations led to a massive federal investigation. Within weeks, 4 senior executives at Nutritional Systems Incorporated were arrested on charges far more serious than what Williams had faced. The U.S. Attorney's Office was forced to dismiss all charges against Williams and issued a public apology. The 10th Circuit Court of Appeals dismissed the government's appeal of Elizabeth's order as moot. Marcus Williams, after spending nearly a year in federal prison for crimes he did not commit, was finally released. The media coverage of Williams' exoneration was extensive. Reporters wanted to know how an innocent man had been convicted with such apparently strong evidence against him. They wanted to understand how the real criminals had gotten away with their scheme for so long. And many wanted to talk to Judge Elizabeth Morrison, the federal judge whose decision to grant a new trial had kept the case alive long enough for the truth to emerge. Elizabeth declined most interview requests. She did not want to be seen as seeking attention or credit for simply doing her job. But she agreed to speak with one reporter from a legal affairs publication who wanted to focus on the systemic issues the case revealed about how wrongful convictions could occur even in federal court with experienced judges and attorneys involved. In that interview, Elizabeth was careful not to criticize her judicial colleague who had presided over the trial, the prosecutors who had brought the case, or even Williams's original defense attorney. She emphasized that the case illustrated how sophisticated fraud could fool everyone, and how important it was for all actors in the justice system to remain vigilant and questioning even when evidence seemed clear-cut. But Elizabeth could not stop thinking about what had happened and what had almost happened. If Patricia Valdez had not had a crisis of conscience, if she had not come forward with evidence, Marcus Williams might have served 13 years for crimes he did not commit. His daughter Lily might have gone through her cancer treatments without her father. An innocent man's life would have been destroyed while the guilty parties went free. And it had been pure chance, luck, accident that had prevented this miscarriage of justice. Elizabeth tried to return to her normal judicial routine. She had dozens of other cases on her docket that needed attention. She had law clerks who were researching pending matters and drafting opinions. She had oral arguments scheduled and trials to preside over. But she found it difficult to focus. Every time she sentenced a defendant, she wondered if they were truly guilty, or if there might be another Marcus Williams sitting before her, an innocent person convicted by a confluence of bad luck, insufficient defense, and evidence that seemed clear but was actually manufactured. 3 months after Williams's release, Elizabeth received an unexpected letter at her chambers. It was from Williams himself. He thanked her for having the courage to grant his motion for a new trial, despite the likelihood of criticism and reversal. He told her that Lily's cancer was in remission, that she was back in school and doing well, that they were trying to rebuild their lives. But he also told her about something that was weighing on him. Williams wrote that he had been contacted by a lawyer representing 3 other former employees of Nutritional Systems, Inc., who had been convicted of various crimes, embezzlement, fraud, falsifying records over the past decade. These individuals were claiming they too had been framed as part of a pattern of retaliation against employees who had raised concerns about company practices. Williams wanted to know if there was anything he could do to help these people, if his experience could somehow be used to right other wrongs. Elizabeth read the letter several times. As a sitting federal judge, There were strict limits on what she could do. She could not advocate for defendants or involve herself in cases outside her official capacity. She could not use her position to influence other legal proceedings. The judicial ethics rules were clear and for good reason. Judges had to maintain impartiality and the appearance of impartiality. But the letter planted a seed in Elizabeth's mind, an idea that would grow over the following weeks into something that would reshape her entire understanding of her role and her purpose. She began researching the other cases Williams had mentioned. She discovered that all 3 individuals had been convicted in federal court in Colorado, though none before her. She found newspaper articles about their cases. She read appellate opinions affirming their convictions. On the surface, the cases seemed unrelated to each other and to Williams's case. But when she looked more carefully, patterns emerged. All 3 had worked for Nutritional Systems Incorporated. All 3 had been convicted of financial crimes. All 3 had apparently raised concerns about company practices before being accused. Elizabeth knew she could not personally investigate these cases or get involved in any way that might be seen as improper. But she also could not simply ignore what appeared to be evidence of a systematic pattern of injustice. She thought about what her mother had taught her about the law, that it was not just a set of rules, but a framework for pursuing justice and protecting human dignity. She thought about the oath she had taken when she became a judge, to administer justice without respect to persons and to faithfully and impartially discharge her duties. After weeks of internal debate, Elizabeth made a decision. She would reach out to Marcus Williams, not as a judge, but as a private citizen exercising her First Amendment rights to free speech and association. She would be scrupulously careful to avoid any impropriety or appearance of impropriety. She would not discuss any cases that might come before her. She would not use her position to influence anything. But she would listen to what Williams had to say about these other potential wrongful convictions, and if appropriate, she would connect him with resources that might be able to help. She sent a brief reply to Williams's letter through proper channels, thanking him for writing and suggesting that if he wished to discuss the matters he had raised, he could contact her through a private email address she maintained separately from her judicial accounts. She knew this was walking a fine line, that some might question whether it was appropriate for a federal judge to have any contact with a former defendant outside official proceedings. But Elizabeth also believed that judges were citizens too, that they had rights and responsibilities beyond their official duties, and that as long as she was careful to avoid conflicts of interest, there was nothing inherently wrong with caring about wrongful convictions and wanting to be part of the solution. Williams responded quickly. He asked if they could meet in person to discuss not just the other potential wrongful convictions, but something bigger he had been thinking about. Elizabeth suggested they meet at a coffee shop far from the federal courthouse, at a time when she was not on duty. When Williams arrived, he looked different than he had in court. He was wearing casual civilian clothes. His hair was neatly trimmed. His face had filled out slightly, but his eyes still carried that same weight of sadness she had seen during his sentencing. They talked for nearly 3 hours. Williams told her about his experience in federal prison, about the other inmates he had met who claimed to be innocent, about the common patterns he had noticed in many of their stories. He talked about how difficult it was to adjust to freedom after having his name cleared, how people still looked at him with suspicion because they remembered his conviction but had not followed the exoneration, how hard it was to find employment with a criminal case on his record, even though the charges had been dismissed. But mostly Williams talked about Lily. He described watching her go through chemotherapy while he sat helpless in prison, receiving updates through brief phone calls that cost a fortune, and letters that took days to arrive. He talked about the promise he had made to her that he would prove his innocence, and how, even though that promise had been fulfilled, he still felt like he had let her down by not being there during her worst moments. He said that Lily had told him during a recent conversation that she wanted him to help other kids whose parents were in prison, especially kids who were sick and needed their parents. This, Williams explained, was what he wanted to talk to Elizabeth about. He wanted to establish a foundation to help families navigate the intersection of serious illness and criminal justice involvement. Not just families where the incarcerated person might be innocent, though that would be part of it, but any family where a child was facing a health crisis while a parent dealt with the criminal justice system. He wanted to provide financial assistance, connect families with legal resources, offer emotional support, and advocate for policies that would keep families together during medical emergencies, even when one parent was incarcerated. Williams said he had some money from the settlement of a wrongful conviction lawsuit against Nutritional Systems Incorporated and the individuals who had framed him. He had spoken with some attorneys about setting up a non-profit organization. But what he needed was someone who understood the legal system from the inside, who had credibility and connections, who could help the foundation navigate the complex intersection of healthcare, criminal law, and family services. He said he understood if Elizabeth felt she couldn't get involved because of her position, but he had to ask because he believed she was someone who truly cared about justice beyond just following procedure. Elizabeth sat quietly for a long moment after Williams finished speaking. She knew that getting involved in this foundation would be complicated. Federal judges were allowed to participate in some charitable and educational activities, but there were restrictions. She would need to be careful not to participate in fundraising activities or lend the prestige of her judicial office to the foundation. She would need to ensure that her involvement did not create conflicts of interest with cases that might come before her. She would need to get approval from the Judicial Council for any official capacity involvement. But as she thought about Williams's proposal, Elizabeth realized this was exactly the kind of work she had hoped to do when she first went to law school. Before the career paths and professional advancement opportunities and political considerations had channeled her into more conventional roles. This was about helping people who fell through the cracks of systems that were supposed to protect them. This was about ensuring that criminal justice involvement didn't destroy families or prevent children from getting the care and support they needed. This was about using her knowledge and experience to make a real difference in people's lives. She told Williams she needed time to think about how she could appropriately be involved. She explained the ethical constraints on federal judges and the need to avoid any appearance of impropriety. But she also told him that in principle, she believed this was important work and that she wanted to find a way to contribute if it could be done properly. They agreed to stay in touch while Elizabeth researched the ethical parameters, and Williams continued developing the foundation's structure and mission. Over the next several months, Elizabeth worked quietly behind the scenes to determine how she could participate in Williams' foundation without violating judicial ethics rules. She consulted with the circuit's Judicial Ethics Council, who reviewed her proposed involvement and concluded that she could serve on the foundation's board and participate in educational programming as long as she did not use her judicial position for fundraising, did not participate in any matter that might come before her as a judge, and made clear that she was acting in her personal capacity and not as a representative of the federal judiciary. The foundation officially launched 10 months after Williams's exoneration. It was called the Lily Williams Foundation, named after Marcus's daughter, and its mission was to provide support to families dealing with serious childhood illness while a parent faced criminal justice involvement. Elizabeth served on the board of directors along with physicians, social workers, criminal defense attorneys, and formerly incarcerated parents. She kept her involvement relatively low profile, not wanting media attention that might focus on her judicial position rather than the foundation's work. The foundation started small, helping a handful of families in Colorado navigate the complex challenges of maintaining family connections during incarceration, while also dealing with childhood cancer, heart conditions, cystic fibrosis, and other serious illnesses. They provided financial assistance for travel to visit incarcerated parents, helped arrange medical furloughs for parents to be present during critical treatments, connected families with pro bono legal services, and created support groups where parents could share experiences without judgment. Elizabeth found this work deeply fulfilling in ways her judicial duties were not. As a judge, she had power and prestige, but she was also constrained by procedure, precedent, and the adversarial nature of litigation. She ruled on motions and presided over trials, but she rarely got to see the human impact of her decisions beyond the immediate parties. With the foundation, she was directly touching lives, solving real problems, helping families stay together during impossibly difficult times. She attended foundation meetings, helped develop policies and programs, mentored young lawyers who wanted to work on wrongful conviction cases, and occasionally spoke at conferences about criminal justice reform. But Elizabeth's involvement with the foundation came at a cost. Some of her judicial colleagues questioned whether it was appropriate for a sitting federal judge to be so publicly associated with an organization that sometimes criticized the criminal justice system. A few prominent defense attorneys complained that her involvement created the appearance that she might be biased in favor of defendants in criminal cases before her. The Judicial Council received several complaints about her activities, though after investigation they found she had not violated any ethics rules. The situation came to a head 18 months after the foundation's launch. Elizabeth was presiding over the trial of a police officer charged with civil rights violations for using excessive force during an arrest. The case was highly publicized and politically charged. The defense attorney filed a motion for recusal, arguing that Elizabeth's involvement with the Lily Williams Foundation demonstrated bias against law enforcement and in favor of criminal defendants. The motion cited several speeches Elizabeth had given at foundation events, where she had discussed problems with the criminal justice system and the need for reform. Elizabeth was shocked by the recusal motion. She had been scrupulously careful to separate her foundation work from her judicial duties. She had never expressed views about law enforcement in general or about the appropriate outcome in any category of cases. Her speeches had focused narrowly on the need to support families dealing with childhood illness and criminal justice involvement, not on broader criminal justice policy. But she also understood that even the appearance of bias could undermine public confidence in the judiciary. After much agonizing reflection, Elizabeth decided not to recuse herself from the case. She issued a detailed order explaining that her involvement with the foundation focused on a specific narrow issue, supporting families with sick children, and did not reflect any general bias for or against any category of litigants. She noted that judges were allowed and even encouraged to participate in educational and charitable activities, that restricting judges from all involvement in organizations that touched on legal issues would prevent them from contributing their expertise to important social problems. She concluded that a reasonable observer, knowing all the facts, would not question her impartiality in the case before her. The trial proceeded without incident. Elizabeth presided fairly over both sides. The jury ultimately convicted the officer on some charges and acquitted on others. Neither party appealed on the basis of judicial bias, and the case was resolved without any suggestion that Elizabeth's rulings had been improper. But the experience left her shaken and uncertain about whether she could continue balancing her judicial duties with her foundation work. She met with Williams to discuss her concerns. They sat in the same coffee shop where they had first talked about the foundation, and Elizabeth explained the pressure she was facing to step back from her involvement. Williams listened carefully, his face showing understanding and sadness in equal measure. He told her that he would never want her to compromise her judicial career for the Foundation, that the work was important, but not more important than her ability to serve justice from the bench. But then Williams said something that surprised Elizabeth. He told her that the Foundation had given him more than just a way to help other families. It had given him a purpose that went beyond his own exoneration, beyond his own pain. He said that working with families, seeing children get the care they needed while maintaining connections with incarcerated parents, watching some of those parents get released and reunite with healthy children, all of this had helped him heal from the trauma of his own wrongful conviction and Lily's illness. He said that Lily had recovered from her cancer and was now a healthy, thriving teenager, and he credited the Foundation's work, the focus on helping others, with giving both of them a way to transform their worst experiences into something positive. Williams told Elizabeth that whatever she decided about her level of involvement, the Foundation would continue. They had hired a full-time executive director, developed relationships with hospitals and correctional facilities, secured grant funding from several major donors. The work would go on. But he wanted her to know that her involvement had been crucial, not just logistically, but symbolically. Having a federal judge willing to say publicly that the criminal justice system sometimes failed families, that procedural correctness was not the same as justice, that institutions needed to be more responsive to human needs. This had given the Foundation credibility and had opened doors that would otherwise have remained closed. Elizabeth went home that night and thought deeply about her choices. She could step back from the Foundation entirely, focus solely on her judicial duties, avoid any further controversy or criticism. Many judges would make that choice, and it would be completely defensible. Or she could continue her involvement while being even more careful about maintaining boundaries and avoiding conflicts. Or she could make a more radical choice, one that had been lurking in the back of her mind for months, but that she had been afraid to articulate even to herself. She could resign from the federal bench and devote herself full-time to the Foundation's work. The idea terrified her. She was only 40 years old. She had lifetime tenure as a federal judge, one of the most prestigious and secure positions in American law. She had clerks who relied on her, colleagues who respected her, litigants who deserved a thoughtful judge presiding over their cases. Walking away from all of that to work for a small non-profit would seem crazy to most people. Her mother, her former mentors, her law school classmates, they would all think she had lost her mind. But as Elizabeth thought about the past 2 years since she had sentenced Marcus Williams, about all the time she had spent on Foundation work evenings and weekends, about how much more fulfilled she felt helping families directly rather than presiding over legal proceedings, she realized that the crazy choice might actually be the one that made the most sense for her. She had become a judge because she wanted to serve justice. But she had discovered that there were many ways to serve justice, and the judicial robe was not the only uniform worth wearing. Elizabeth spent the next 3 months carefully considering her decision. She talked to her mother, who surprised her by being supportive rather than disappointed. She spoke with several former judges who had left the bench for various reasons, and who assured her that life after the judiciary could be rich and meaningful. She consulted with the Foundation's board about what role she might play if she joined them full-time, and she thought long and hard about whether this decision was driven by genuine conviction or by a desire to escape the pressures and constraints of judicial office. In the end, Elizabeth concluded that resigning was the right choice for her. Not because being a judge was not important or valuable, not because she had failed in that role or been unsuited for it, but because she had discovered a different calling, one that allowed her to use her legal training and judicial experience in a more direct and personal way to help people who needed it most. She submitted her resignation to the president with a letter explaining that she wanted to focus on charitable work, addressing the needs of families affected by both serious illness and criminal justice involvement. The resignation made headlines. Some praised Elizabeth for her integrity and willingness to follow her conscience. Others criticized her for abandoning her judicial responsibilities and suggested she had always been too soft on criminals to be an effective judge. Legal scholars debated whether it was appropriate for judges to resign in order to do advocacy work related to legal issues. But Elizabeth largely ignored the commentary. She had made her decision based on her own values and priorities, and she was at peace with it. She joined the Lily Williams Foundation as its Director of Legal Affairs and Policy. Her responsibilities included overseeing the Foundation's legal assistance programs, training staff and volunteers on criminal justice and healthcare systems, developing policy positions on issues affecting their client families, and serving as a public spokesperson for the Foundation's mission. She took a massive pay cut compared to her judicial salary, giving up lifetime tenure and federal benefits for a position that had to be funded through grants and donations. But she felt lighter and more purposeful than she had in years. Working alongside Marcus Williams turned out to be one of the most rewarding professional relationships of Elizabeth's life. They had complementary skills and perspectives. Marcus brought lived experience and deep emotional understanding of what families faced. Elizabeth brought legal expertise and institutional knowledge that helped the Foundation navigate complex policy environments. Together, they built programs that made real differences in people's lives, one family at a time. The Foundation's work expanded significantly with Elizabeth on board full-time. They opened offices in 3 additional states. They established partnerships with major children's hospitals across the country. They launched a legal clinic that helped challenge wrongful convictions and fight for sentence reductions for incarcerated parents of seriously ill children. They created an advocacy campaign that resulted in several states passing laws, making it easier for incarcerated parents to visit children in hospitals and participate in medical decision-making. One of their most significant achievements was helping secure the release of 2 of the other former Nutritional Systems Incorporated employees, whose cases Marcus had brought to Elizabeth's attention. The Foundation hired investigators who uncovered evidence that these individuals had also been framed as part of the company's pattern of retaliating against whistleblowers. Working with pro bono attorneys, they successfully argued for the convictions to be vacated. Both individuals were released after serving several years for crimes they did not commit, and both chose to get involved with the Foundation's work helping other families. As Elizabeth worked on these cases, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. If she had not granted Marcus Williams's motion for a new trial, if Patricia Valdez had not come forward, if Williams had not written to her about his idea for the Foundation, her life would be completely different. She would likely still be sitting on the federal bench, deciding cases according to law and procedure, respected and secure, but perhaps never knowing whether she was really making the kind of difference she had hoped to make when she first decided to become a lawyer. 5 years after Elizabeth left the bench, the Lily Williams Foundation was recognized as a national leader in supporting families at the intersection of serious illness and criminal justice involvement. They had helped thousands of families, secured the release of dozens of wrongly convicted individuals, and pushed for policy reforms that kept families together during medical crises. Lily Williams herself, now a healthy college student, had joined the Foundation's board and become an eloquent advocate for children with incarcerated parents. Elizabeth sometimes missed aspects of being a judge: the intellectual challenge of complex legal questions, the authority of the courtroom, the sense of being part of an important institution. But she never regretted her decision to leave the bench. She had found her true calling, her real purpose. She was helping people in direct, tangible ways that she could see and measure. She was using everything she had learned as a prosecutor, defense attorney, and judge to fight for justice outside the traditional courtroom setting. Marcus Williams had asked for her help in fulfilling what he called his last wish, honoring his daughter's memory by helping other families facing similar challenges. In agreeing to help him, Elizabeth had discovered that sometimes the most important work happens not in formal institutions with traditional authority structures, but in the spaces between systems, where passionate individuals work together to address needs that institutions cannot or will not meet. Their partnership had transformed both of their lives. Marcus had gone from wrongly convicted felon to respected advocate and foundation leader. Elizabeth had gone from federal judge to non-profit director and policy reformer. Neither had followed a conventional path. Both had taken enormous risks, but together they had created something that mattered, something that would continue making a difference long after they were gone. As Elizabeth sat in the foundation's office one evening, reviewing grant applications and preparing for a board meeting, she thought about all the families they had helped, and all the families still out there who needed support. The work was never finished. There would always be more wrongful convictions to fight, more sick children who needed their parents, more systems that failed to recognize human needs. But knowing that she was part of the solution, that her decision to help one man years ago had led to all of this, filled Elizabeth with a sense of purpose and satisfaction that no judicial opinion could match. She thought about the young judge she had been when Marcus Williams first stood before her at sentencing, how certain she had been that she knew her role and her limits. She thought about the voice in the back of her mind that had told her something was wrong with his conviction, and how easily she could have ignored that voice and moved on to the next case. She thought about all the moments where she could have made different choices, safer choices, and how those choices would have meant Marcus stayed in prison, Lily grew up without her father, and none of the families they had helped would have received the support they desperately needed. Dear viewers, sometimes fulfilling one person's last wish becomes the beginning of something that changes countless lives. Elizabeth Morrison thought she was serving justice as a federal judge. Instead, she discovered that true justice isn't just about following rules or working within systems. Sometimes it requires individuals to step outside their roles, take risks, and fight for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. Marcus Williams's last wish wasn't just about proving his innocence. It was about transforming pain into purpose, turning personal tragedy into a force for positive change, and ensuring that a little girl's dream of having her father prove his innocence would live on through the lives of other children who needed someone to fight for them. Their story reminds us that the most important promises aren't always the ones we make to the living. Sometimes they're the ones we make to memories, to principles, and to futures we may never see, but hope to make possible for others. The scales of justice are not just balanced in courtrooms with robed judges and formal procedures. Sometimes the most important work of justice happens in the quiet spaces where determined individuals refuse to accept that the system's answer is the final answer, where compassion combines with expertise to create new possibilities for families who have nowhere else to turn.